prepared all this. And thank you for helping us record this meeting so that others who are not here may enjoy it and learn from it as well. And we pray that, as we leave this session today, we do so renewed in spirit, renewed in energy, and renewed in commitment to spread your gospel. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Thank you, everybody, once again for joining. And we have been announcing several new programming coming up, and there's several other things being planned that have not yet been announced. So would encourage everyone to, if you haven't registered for email updates, please do. And if you don't visit the website regularly, please do. With that, I will pass the microphone over to Kevin. And Kevin, please take it away.
Thanks, Jim. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Let me share my screen. This is going to be another more image-rich presentation. So I'm probably going to just stay situated the way that I'm here up in the corner, and we will work through the slides as I talk. So I'm going to jump right in. Funny thing about Book 10, I kind of feel about Book 10 the way Augustine felt about time, which we'll get into that when we get to Book 11, which he said, I understand time until somebody asks me to explain it to them. And I kind of felt that way about Book 10, but yeah, don't worry, I feel like I really do understand it now. But the joke in my own mind coming into this was, well, I felt like I understood Book 10 until somebody asked me to explain it to them, and then that's a different story. But having said that, really just in jest, Book 10 is a giant, and so I'm going to probably pick up the pace just a little bit to make sure I get through everything, because the punchline at the end of Book 10 is kind of astonishing. This journey that Augustine takes us on ends in a place that most people would not ever see coming, and probably doesn't get the attention that it deserves, in part because books 10 through 13 tend to be understudied relative to the first 9 books of Confessions. So having said that, I'm going to go ahead and jump in here, give a quick explanation of where we're going tonight, explain what you see on the screen in front of you, and then we will keep trucking. So plan for tonight is this. First of all, we've got to make sense of the quantum leap from books 1 through 9 to Book 10. Augustine admittedly is no help whatsoever in this regard. We're on our own, but it's not that difficult to figure out. In fact, we figured it out last time, and we'll rehash that quickly. Once we've done that, the leap from books 1 to 9 to 10, that brings us to the second thing, which we can take inventory of how Augustine is organizing his material in Book 10. But this is actually way easier by virtue of the fact that Augustine actually tells us the plan of Book 10, but he doesn't tell us the plan of Book 10 until the very end of Book 10. So if you didn't read to the end of Book 10, that's okay, it's a monster. But if you got to the end of Book 10 and you were reading carefully, you might have realized, oh, I get to the end of Book 10 and he actually tells me what the whole thing was about. So we'll demonstrate that. And then once we've done that, we're going to just tease out some of the major themes of this enormous book, which is nearly twice the length of every other book in the Confessions, and is certainly twice the depth and twice the breadth. In prior meetings, we squeezed 2 books into one. If there were more time, which there's not, I would have definitely split this book out into 2, but we're going to have to do what we can in 1 hour or so together. When we get into this, though, we're going to see something. And what we'll see is that Augustine has a massive amount of just pure intuition about the nature of memory. And his intuition about memory is far-ranging and remarkable and remarkably accurate. So much so that what Augustine says in Book 10 and then further in Book 11, which we'll get to next month, remains relevant to the contemporary concerns of behavioral science. Augustine still speaks to this intersection of psychology, sociology, and cognitive science in ways that frankly surprise people. And so on the screen, we've got an academic article. This is a journal article that would still be considered fairly recent for this discipline in 2013, where these individuals who happen to be French, it has nothing to do necessarily with the control of Augustinian scholarship by French Catholics. This is a totally different discipline. But this is an article by French scholars who are working in behavioral sciences And they specifically point back to books 10 and 11 and note that Augustine is the first person to begin to talk in any way scientifically about the relationship of memory to time. And this is important for us because when we get to book 11, Augustine is going to try to explain the nature of time to us, but there's no way to make sense of that if we haven't passed through book 10 and understood what he has to say about memory. And so that's where we're headed now. But first, let's just take a couple minutes and talk about the quantum leap from book 9 to book 10. So the first thing that we've got to acknowledge is from book 9 to book 10, there is a leap in time and there's a leap in place. And so we covered this at the end of book 9. Last time when we were together, I thought rather cleverly referred to this as the epilogue to the epilogue, but it's this in brief. At the end of book 9, there's Monica's death. Augustine remains in Rome for about a year, and then he returns to Tagaste in North Africa. He lives this quasi-monastic life with an inner circle of friends. His son, Adeodatus, is there, but dies shortly after they get back to Africa. Augustine goes up to Hippo to recruit someone for his monastery, but he's forcibly seized and pressed into the service of the church as priest. In just a few years, he would succeed Valerius as the Bishop of Hippos, of course, why we know Augustine as Augustine, Bishop of Hippo. But then about 5 years after he's made bishop, he publishes the Confessions. The theories for why he chose to write the Confessions are various and don't really concern us at the moment, but we do feel confident, as we said last time, that something did happen. And what happened was Augustine went back and had this immersive experience reading the letters of St. Paul, especially Romans, and became convinced of the absolute primacy of God's grace in our salvation. And so that then becomes the lens through which he looks back at his own life and tells the story of God's grace at work in ways that were unexpected and sometimes unintended. Okay, so that's the leap in time and place. Fine. Okay, but there's a leap in space as well. And what I mean by that is that in book 10, the space of the Confessions is here. This is where we are. It's not located in time and place in a geographical sense, but when we are in book 10, pretty much for the entirety of book 10, we really are in Augustine's own mind. This is the location of book 10, which makes it obviously radically different than anything that we've seen so far. But actually, if you think about it for a moment, what has been implicit in the first 9 books of the Confessions is now actually acknowledged explicitly by Augustine, and it's this: that we've been in Augustine's memory the whole time. I mean, books 1 through 9, if you really step back from this and think for a second, books 1 through 9 are Augustine sitting alone in his study, in dialogue or confession to God, and we're just overhearing it. And all of this is happening in 397, and he's drawing from his memory everything that's in the first 9 books and delivering this as a confession. And then he says, but wait, people want to know what life looks like for me today. And so that's what book 10 is. We are, in this case, actually literally in Augustine's mind, because he's going to explore and tell us how he thinks his memory works and how the human memory in general works. Okay, so that's the leap from book 9 to 10. This brings us to our next point. How does Augustine organize book 10? I want to say just a word on this because this gets an enormous amount of attention in the academic world. It shows up in the introductions to almost every edition of the Confessions. So this quantum leap of time, place, and space, our group here reading Confessions is not the first group to identify this and feel like it's worth talking about. This was a major, major concern of Augustinian scholarship, especially in France in the 20th century. Scholars asked questions about, and in fact, they vigorously challenged the structural integrity of Confessions. Does book 10 really fit? This was a question. Does the movement from spiritual biography in 1 through 9 to memory in 10 to this kind of wild exposition of the opening chapter of Genesis in 11, 13, does this even make any sense? These are the sorts of questions that academic people, sincere academic people, there's not necessarily malice involved here, but this is what they wondered, and some thought that it didn't really make a lot of sense. One scholar in particular, the massively influential French scholar Henri Mareux, remarked, "Augustine writes badly." Of course, he said it in French, but it was a comment that stuck. Not too long after writing that, he issued a second edition of what was his major work, and he expressed regret for the remark and tried to retract it, but in some sense, the damage was done. When people think of Meru, they tend to think of his very bold 3 words, Augustine writes badly. However, Augustine describes the 13 books of the Confessions without any hesitation or any qualification or any qualms as to its design or his purpose. In the retractions that Augustine wrote a few years before the end of his life, so this is like 30 years after the writing of Confessions, he says this: "The 13 books of my Confessions concern both my bad and my good actions, for which they praise our just and our good God. In so doing, they arouse the human mind and affections towards him. As far as I'm concerned, they had this effect on me when I was writing them, and they still do when I read them now. What others think about them is for them to say, but I know that they have given pleasure in the past and still do give pleasure to many of the brethren. The first 10 books were written about myself, the last 3 about Holy Scripture." Well, for as plain and uncontroversial as that is, the level of academic annoyance with Augustine on this point has led to all sorts of theories about the composition of Confessions, including that it was released in serial, that is in editions over time, that it originally ended at book 9, and then book 10 came later, and then books 11, 13 later still, that Augustine's ambition really was to write an entire commentary on Scripture beginning in Genesis, and that's what we get in 11, 13, and the list goes on and on and on. But there's absolutely no manuscript evidence to support any of this. The Confessions, as we have it, matches that earliest manuscript of Confessions, which I shared with the group on a couple of occasions in earlier studies. So, taken on the whole, that is to say, considering Augustine's own testimony nearly 30 years after he wrote the Confessions, and the fact that every surviving manuscript includes all 13 books, for our purposes, we're simply going to accept that this is exactly what Augustine wrote and intended. So consequently, our best bet to try to figure out how the pieces fit together is to look to the books themselves. And that's where we will turn our attention in just a moment. So our immediate concern is book 10 itself. We want to know how this book is put together because we need a map to make sense of something that's this big. So this actually dawned on me about 48 hours ago. I've been reading book 10 over and over and over and listening to it and like just mulling this whole thing over. And the epiphany came like 2 days ago when I was reading through the end, and it struck me. And I realized, okay, when you get to the end of book 10, Augustine actually tells you what's going on, which is strangely, this is actually how French academic literature works. The table of contents is always the very last page of the book. I'm sure there's no real correlation there. But this is what Augustine does. So if we look at book 10, chapter 40, section 65, these are the last 65 to 70. These are the last 6 sections of book 10. And if we listen carefully to what Augustine is saying, it actually matches almost exactly, going back to the beginning of the book, and gives us an idea of what's going on. So let me just walk us through this quickly. And this will help us have like big picture what's going on through 10, and then we'll kind of start teasing out some of these themes. So what you've got going on here is in the middle are the quotes from these last 5 or 6 chapters of book 10. To the right of it, in parentheses, is the citation of where these are all direct quotes of what Augustine is saying. The left-hand column running down is where Augustine is referring back to in book 10. One just has to do quite a bit of careful reading to figure this out. He doesn't say this explicitly, but it works. Just, I guess, trust me for the moment, it works out really, really well. So Augustine says this at the end of book 10. He says, he basically says, in summary, to the best of my powers of sense perception, I traveled through the external world. This is the starting point. Okay, well, that's at 10.6.8. This is obvious. And then he said, starting from myself, I examined my own senses. The 5 senses are a major organizing device in book 10. Well, that's at 10.6.9. And then he said, from there, the external world to my own senses, I went into the recesses of my memory. Okay, well, that's 10.8.12. I traversed everything and tried to make distinctions and evaluate each mental object. We talked about this at 10.9.16. Then in the wide riches of memory, I examined other things, hiding some away and drawing out others. Well, this is his discussion on memory and forgetting at 10.15.23. But in all these investigations, I can find no safe place for my soul except in you. Well, that's his discussion of the happy life in memory, which starts at 10:20:29. And sometimes you cause me, now Augustine speaking in the present here, and sometimes you cause me to enter into extraordinary depth of feeling marked by a strange sweetness. Well, there's a term for that, and it's called joy. And this is what he talks about at 10:22:32. And then he goes on and says, under the three forms of desire, I have considered the sicknesses of my sins. Well, this is the passage from 1 John that he works out starting at 10:31:41. Okay, so that's the book leading up to 10:42:67. We're going to stop there because everything that we just said is his retrospective on what just happened in book 10. And if we take this, we can actually flesh this out a little bit and give ourselves an outline that makes sense. And it looks like this. It's pretty straightforward. Like we've learned in every book, there's a preface or a preamble where Augustine sets the table. Generally, there's a lot of psalm quotes. He gets some of his major ideas in play, makes some sort of confession, some sort of praise and thanksgiving. So we get this. Okay. Book 10 breaks down into two sections then. The first section is the acknowledgement that human beings are reaching for God. And then he's going to walk through that process that he just described, the external world, taking inventory of his senses, and then going deep inside of himself and really trying to make sense of the human experience of memory. So that's part one. Part two is entirely organized around a single passage from the letter 1 John. And we'll see this in a second graphically. But he walks through this classic verse, which was massively formative for Augustine. It's translated various ways, but the concupiscence of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life. There are various ways you get this, but you get this threefold or this triad of sin that John talks about. Well, Augustine uses this to describe where he is at today in the process of sanctification. And he says some things I think are massively important for us, just in terms of practical Christian living. And then he takes us to the conclusion. We're not going to talk about that yet because I want to save that for when we get to it in the last couple minutes of our time together. So in this preface or this preamble to book 10, Augustine explains the program of book 10. He's seeking to confess his current state of mind to God. We saw that in the splash page when we all entered the room. God who already knows everything. And additionally, to those people who can enter into sympathy with him and participate with him in thanksgiving and prayer. And so the first half of book 10 is taken up with this theme we talked about. Human beings are searching for God. It takes place within themselves and importantly within their memory. Augustine's going to reflect on the contents of his memory, but especially on one thing in particular, which is his belief. And this is something that's overlooked, sadly, but his belief in what I've termed original happiness, which is kind of the other side of the coin of original sin. And we'll see that in a second when we get there. Let's move on from here for one moment, just in the hopes of having something that catches our attention for a second here. This particular verse basically is the organizing principle of the second half of book 10, which ostensibly is about memory, but Augustine takes memory and goes a little different direction with it because he wants us to know where he is really at in the process of becoming a saint. So nice little poster, fine, looks like something you would see on probably a college wall. But the context of this from 1 John reads like this: do not love the world or the things of the world. If anybody loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, and this is the NABRE translation, sensual lust, enticement for the eyes, and a pretentious life is not from the Father, but is from the world. Yet the world and its enticement are passing away, but whoever does the will of God will remain forever. Just quickly, parenthetically, after reading Confessions, it's not at all unusual, and these conversations have actually already started. People that have worked their way through Confessions and been good readers of it ask, okay, well, what's next? Man, Confessions was great. What should I read next? And the seemingly obvious answer is City of God. There's good reasons for that. But on reflection, I think many students of Augustine who have felt deeply moved by the Confessions would actually do well to take a detour first and head into his sermons, which tend to possess a lot more of the same spirit of what we find in Confessions. And so you will probably be unsurprised to learn that the first epistle of John is something that Augustine preached through. It was actually through Easter week. I don't remember exactly which year, but preached 10 sermons on the first letter of John, from which this verse comes from. This would actually be not a terrible place to land next in your own personal reading if you wanted to continue the journey with Augustine. Okay, so let's just talk for a few minutes about what Augustine is doing in the preface to Book 10. And I'll leave the outline up there because A, it helps me, and B, hopefully it's instructive and helpful for you as well. So in Book 10, as we've said, Augustine's looking to confess his current state of mind to God who knows all, to the people who can enter into sympathy with him and participate with him in the way that he intends. And so Augustine's saying something that's rather important as an author, and it's that the inner meaning of the Confessions is actually closed to people that are merely curious about other people's sins. So Augustine's anticipating those whose hands the Confessions might fall into. And the main takeaway really from the preface is that Augustine actually introduces a condition for the right way to read the Confessions. He introduces, as it were, a hermeneutic, that is the thing that's necessary for the correct interpretation of his work. How am I supposed to read the Confessions? Well, Augustine actually says, if you want to read this book correctly, it's about the disposition of your own heart when you come to the book. And that's actually a rather shocking claim by an author. It's not academically, can you wrestle with this in the right way? It's that your heart has to be oriented the right way, or the book is not going to make sense to you. It is a rather dramatic claim. But in his own words, he says this. He said, and this is at the very beginning of Book 10, I also, Lord, so make my confession to you that I may be heard by people to whom I cannot prove that my confession is true. But those whose ears are opened by love, believe me. Okay, we also don't want to miss that there are two significant echoes that happen in Book 10 that lead us back to Book 1. Let me explain. If you Google narrow, shabby house, this is probably the best thing you can get. But let me explain what I mean by this, because I think it does justice to the idea. So in the introduction to Book 10, Augustine says, he's addressing God, of course, he says, power of my soul, enter into it and fit it for yourself so that you may have and hold it without spot or blemish. This is like almost the opening line of Book 10, okay? That should sound somewhat familiar because it's one of the opening lines of the early part of Book 1. You might remember the beginning of Book 1, Augustine says, the house of my soul is too small for you to come into it. May it be enlarged by you. It is in ruins. Restore it. In your eyes, it has offensive features. And there's more. After the reference to the shabby house, Augustine says something else that echoes what he said at the beginning of Book 1. He says, stir up the heart when people read and hear the confessions of my past wickedness, which you have forgiven and covered up, to grant me happiness in yourself, transforming my soul by faith in your sacrament. And that last tag there, transforming my soul by faith in your sacrament, is going to become very important at the end. Well, this sounds very similar to what he says at the opening of Book 1. He says, you stir man to take pleasure in praising you because you have made us for yourself, and our heart is restless until it rests in you. And so as careful readers, if we hear the echo, we work our way back to where the resonance is coming from, Augustine's making a connection that's actually going to come right out into the forefront at the end of Book 10, which is that he's identifying the place of rest for us, at least relative rest. In the beginning, he just says our heart is restless, it needs to be stirred to find rest in you. And here again, he's saying, stir our hearts, Lord, and he lands somewhere because you're transforming the soul by faith and by the sacrament. And the sacrament, in Augustine's language here, is the Eucharist. This will be more obvious when we get to the very end and get the punchline here. Okay, so back to our outline. When we move into the first section then of Book 10, Augustine has already explained at the end of the book that the search for God begins outward, that is in the external world, and then turns inward. This is in Augustine's mind the natural movement of the soul towards God. But Augustine says this at 10:6. He says, "But heaven and earth and everything in them on all sides tell me to love you, nor do they cease to tell everyone that they are without excuse." And Augustine here is quoting St. Paul at the beginning of Romans. And then in the next paragraph, Augustine says, "Then I turned towards myself and said to myself, 'Who are you?'" So I think Augustine has something to say about the human mind's relation to nature as it's mediated through our senses. And there's really only two responses. And I think this is where Augustine is trying to lead us. Either the mind perceives that the world has been created by God, and he's channeling Paul here. This is what's going on in chapter 1 of Romans. Either the human mind perceives the outside world, the external world, and perceives that it's been created by God, or else, and this is what Augustine says, by love of created things, people are subdued by them, and being thus made subject, become incapable of exercising judgment. Well, this is just exactly what Paul says at the beginning of the book of Romans. These are the two reactions that people have when they see the created world. They either see the created world, something triggers in them, and they say, okay, this leads me irresistibly to the idea that there's got to be someone with divine power who made all of this. Otherwise, the reaction is people just find ways to subject themselves to the created world. And the penalty for this, according to Paul, and Augustine is echoing this, is that they begin to lose any capacity for exercising spiritual judgment. Augustine ends this aspect of the conversation by saying this. He says, "The created order speaks to all, but is understood by those who hear its outward voice and compare it with the truth within themselves." And it is to within himself that Augustine is going to make a very sharp turn and stay for a very long time. But we've got to get the main ideas, at least, of what he's trying to explain to us about memory, because this will help us, I think, immensely just in our own development as human beings and as Catholics and as Christians, but also help us to understand what he's trying to tell us about time when we get to book 11. So the turning point here is at 10:8 in book 10. And Augustine says this, now that he's talked about the external world, he's now internal. And he says, "Therefore, I'm going to rise above the natural capacity of my sense perceptions in a step-by-step ascent to him who made me." And so we can track with him to see where he goes. So this ascent that Augustine is talking about begins with a relatively straightforward observation that our memory retains mental images of everything that enters through the doors of perception. And so he's kind of creating this specialized vocabulary that we've got to just kind of accept and come to terms with. But this idea of a mental image, everything I hear, even everything that I smell or taste, it all creates, we would tend to want to call this a data point. That makes the human mind sound like a computer, which actually would make it sound far less sophisticated than what it really is. But I think Augustine's language is good, is that all of our senses are constantly gathering, and this is part of the wonder of memory. At every moment, all 5 of my senses can be engaged in creating a constant record of mental images that are being stored in my memory. This is the point that Augustine observes. And we may think, okay, well, that kind of seems like, maybe I never thought about that, but that kind of seems like common sense. Okay, but we're saying that as 21st century people who have the benefit of, a lot of developments in psychology, and Augustine didn't have these. I mean, he's the first guy to ever point this out, go inside of himself and find this. So this is what makes it rather remarkable. But further, Augustine says, there's something else going on, though, besides the wonder of memory, that this is how the human person works. There's something else inside of me, which basically what he's doing is he's describing imagination, which is the mind's capacity to take all of these mental images, these impressions that the mind stores, which probably are numbered in the millions or billions. But the mind actually has the capacity of imagination, which means I can take these images, and in my mind, I can actually create new mental images, new mental objects with the things that my memory has stored. And for Augustine, no pun, but his mind is blown when he begins thinking through that this is the fact of how the human person actually works. So for Augustine, as for us today, precisely how all of these mental images are housed in the memory, this is a mystery. We don't know. Human beings, nothing in cognitive science, nothing in the brain sciences has in any way even begun to answer the question, but how does this actually work? We don't know. But what is clear is that the recall of the things obtained through the senses does not require the senses to be engaged in order to experience them. And Augustine realized this. He says, like, I can remember the smell of something, but my sense of smell is not actually activated. I can remember the pain of something, but the sense of touch is not actually activated. This becomes just a whole nother element of the wonder that he experiences at the human person, that my memory retains smells and tastes and sounds, but my senses don't actually have to be activated for my mind to be able to draw them out of the storehouse. So that leads us to our next image. This is, you probably saw this in 8th or 9th grade in a biology class. It's not remarkably sophisticated, I admit that, but what is remarkably sophisticated is this. So I've mentioned Quinn to you before, who is, I think, probably the best commentator on the Confessions, although almost nobody has his book. But he actually says this about this thing that Augustine points out in Book 10. Because Augustine goes to some length to explain the idea that there seems to be different rooms, right, in the memory that store the different mental images that come through the various senses. Okay, Quinn says this. He says, interestingly, modern physiology of the brain confirms Augustine's comment on the selective recall of specific sense data. Various parts of the brain furnish a specialized organic substrata for the psychic functioning of the five senses, which is Quinn's very dramatic way of that picture, right? This is what he's talking about. Visual sensitivity is centered in the occipital lobe, the auditory is in the temporal lobe, while olfactory and gustatory sensations are mediated in an area just below the temporal lobe. The somesthetic sense is localized in the parietal lobe. Okay, so Quinn's no dummy, and he sometimes is challenging to read, but basically what he's telling us is Augustine is the first person to identify this, and he's doing this without any scientific apparatus whatsoever. Just through his own intuition and probably hours and hours of just sitting in silence and thinking, Augustine realizes inside the memory, there's got to be in some way, some kind of partition of how the senses store things. And so, yes, Augustine is a great saint. Yes, he's a doctor of the church. Yes, he's got a great conversion story. But the other thing that maybe Augustine is not as well known for is Augustine has some shocking intuition into psychology and into cognitive sciences that people still look back to and say, yeah, that's pretty much how it works. And it's kind of unbelievable that he figured this out on his own. Okay, so that's that. Back to Augustine's mind. So Augustine says this about the mind. He says, in addition to all of this about the senses, because when I go into my memory, there also I meet myself. I recall what I am, what I have done, and when and where and how I was affected. And so while the individual human being contains their memory, the memory itself for Augustine is seemingly boundless. We can't say that it's infinite. This wouldn't be exactly correct, but it's a source of enormous wonder for Augustine that he really can't seem to get to the end of his own mind and into his the end of his own memory. So Augustine's going to go further with this. Just hang in here with me for just a couple more minutes because we've got to see where he's going to press this out. So as if that weren't enough, Augustine goes further in Book 10, and he recognizes that there's something else in the mind too. So there's everything that comes into the mind through sense perception, but there's another dynamic to the mind, and it's the mind actually stores skills, and it stores pure intellectual objects. And I actually play this game with the kids in my intro to philosophy class, and they're well amused by this, but they get it really quickly though. We talk about Plato and we talk about the ideas, and so the game I play with them is they say, okay, show me the number 3. Okay, what do you think every kid in the room does? And you know what they do, right? Show me the number 3. Every kid does this. Like, nah, that's not 3. I'm like, what? Come on, Mr. Bergdorf. That's 3. I'm like, no, that's not 3. That's 3 fingers. And they kind of chuckle. And they're, what do you mean? So one of them gets up and writes the number 3 on the board. Well, that's 3 then, right? Like, well, no, that's the symbol that we all agree on in Arabic numerals that means the idea of 3. Okay, now they're starting to track with me. And by the time we get to the end of the conversation, I say, okay, show me the number 3. Nobody raises their hands anymore. Because what they realize is, oh, wait a second. The number 3 is an idea in my mind that everybody agrees with. And this is not 3, this is 3 fingers. It's a symbol. And the number 3 written on a board is a symbol, but 3 is actually an intellectual object that's in my mind and in the mind of every other human being. And really, high schoolers grasp this really quickly. Well, this is what Augustine is talking about. Our mind contains all of these intellectual objects that have nothing to do with sense perception. I mean, I understand what three is without smelling it, because that's not possible. I would understand three if I was blind or deaf, because it's an intellectual concept that's in my mind. And so Augustine then becomes one of the first people to really start working this out as well as a part of memory. The fact that our minds actually contain images that come through our senses, but they contain intellectual objects as well. He goes on, okay, so fine, everything that comes in through the senses, intellectual objects, things like number that have nothing to do with my senses. Then he goes to a place that a lot of people quickly relate to as well, which he says, here's the funny thing about memory. Memory retains the four basic affections of the soul, at least how someone in antiquity thought about it, which is desire, joy, fear, and sorrow. Augustine says, I remember these feelings. I remember desire, I remember joy, I remember fear, I remember sorrow. But the crazy thing about memory is I can remember being sad about something, but I don't actually feel sad when I remember being sad. In fact, if it's something that was sinful, I can actually today feel happy about something at one time that I felt sad about, which is rather, and he thinks this is rather remarkable, right? The mind can store all of these experiences and the associated feelings. And when I recall them, I mean, I might, but I don't necessarily have to feel what I felt at that time. And so for Augustine, this is another dynamic of memory that really just, frankly, makes him praise God. He doesn't really have any explanation for how the human being can be so sophisticated. Okay. The last thing that he ends on in this section, somewhat paradoxically, I don't know if you read this and were amused. I'm somewhat amused by it. But Augustine says, paradoxically, the memory also remembers forgetting. Did you catch this in the reading? He spends a little bit of time on this. He said the memory is so sophisticated that you actually remember that you forgot. And then he spends time trying to wrestle with this whole idea. Really what he's wrestling with is like, why do we forget and how do we remember that we forgot? And he's wrestling with this idea of recall of there are things that get buried in our memories that, like, if we work and work and work at it, we can eventually dig these things out. And so for all of this, Augustine has basically done something that nobody in antiquity had ever done, which is, without any kind of scientific apparatus, he goes into himself and he really identifies the 4, 5, 6 functions of memory or the mind that people are still looking back to and saying, yeah, that's still a very reasonable framework for how human beings work. Okay, so let's jump on from there. This brings us to the last part of the section on memory proper. It's this. Augustine says something that I think is a wonderful contribution theologically that most people have missed out on. If you Google the happy life, I don't know why, there are an endless number of images that basically fit this profile. And it's going to be somebody standing in a field, like almost being eclipsed by the brightness of this. And they're all hands are up. I mean, look it up. I promise. Happy life. Click on one of these. It's endless. I don't know how this has found its way into the human consciousness that this is the picture of the happy life, but I think it works. And I think there's so many of them because people look at this and say, oh yeah, what is this person experiencing right now? You look and it's like, oh, well, freedom and peace, the light, clearly has some theological significance. The arm, she's open to it. I mean, this is a picture of fearlessness. And I mean, the proper word actually is joy. That's the word Augustine is going to supply for us. But this is the picture of the happy life. And I think it's effective. We'll keep it up here for a minute while we talk. So anyway, Augustine had this digression at the end of this last section about the whole thing that memory can contain forgetfulness. And he thinks this is kind of really fun to play with and rather remarkable. It may seem a little redundant to us, but it actually does serve a very, very important literary purpose. Because when Augustine transitions to the happy life, Augustine feels like this is something that's in the memory that's been forgotten. This is the aha moment. Okay, now I get why Augustine is always clever. Everything's on purpose. Why talk about memory forgetting? Because he's going to go to the thing that really matters to him, which is the happy life, which he thinks is in our memory. and that we have forgotten. So, as has been remarked a bunch of times over the course of our meetings together, when Augustine was 17, he picked up a book by Cicero called the Hortensius. I told you, before, this was a book I spent a ton of time on when I was at Oxford, but it impressed him with its most basic of philosophical notions. And Augustine returns to this over and over and over again, even till the last things that he's writing as a 70-year-old man. The key phrase in Cicero's Hortensius is this. Some of you might remember it. Surely everyone wants to be happy. Surely everyone wants to be happy. And for Augustine, this becomes almost the most basic philosophical axiom of his life. Surely everyone wants to be happy. So Augustine's argument here in Book 10, it's rather simple in relation to memory. Everybody wants to be happy, and seemingly it exists in everyone's memory, but how? Because Augustine's argument is everybody wants to be happy. Everybody wants the happy life. And nobody wants something that they don't have any definition of. But if you ask any person if they want to be happy, the answer is always yes. I mean, you can't find a sane person who says, I want to be unhappy. Because the only reason anyone would want to be unhappy is because they think it would make them happy, which is, of course, self-refuting. Everybody wants to be happy. Augustine connects this to memory. What he does is he traces this back to the garden. He traces this back to the first Adam and the notion of original sin. And Augustine coined the phrase original sin, so he's certainly the authority on what this means. But he also buffers this idea of original sin with a phrase I've coined, which is original happiness. And it's Augustine's idea. I'm just attaching a term to it. Because for Augustine, it would seem that human beings are born with a predisposition to evil. I think we all agree with it. Well, I mean, we have to agree with this because this is what the Catechism tells us, and this is what Augustine discovered and articulated in very clear terms. People are born with a predisposition to evil. This is our nature. But the other side of this that never gets talked about is that people also are born with a predisposition to try to be happy. This actually, I think, has an enormous tempering effect, just on kind of our anthropological understanding. Yes, people have a predisposition to evil, but everybody wants to be happy. And Augustine says both of these go back to the garden. Both of these go back to the fall. There is somehow, in some way that he can't articulate, a memory of that original happiness that we're all trying to get back to. And somebody else picked up on this as well, and you're never going to guess who it is, but it was Joni Mitchell. I mean, most people on this call probably know who Joni Mitchell is, right? Okay. And some of you already know where I'm going. So if you don't, if you get a chance, don't listen to the Crosby, Stills, Nash Young version. Go listen to the original Woodstock by Joni Mitchell, because there's a line in there that actually captures this exactly. You think I'm joking, but I'm not, because this is what she says. She says, we are stardust, billion-year-old carbon. We are golden, caught in the devil's bargain, and we've got to get ourselves back to the garden. Caught in the devil's bargain, we've got to get ourselves back in the garden. Well, that's in 1960s speak. That's exactly what Augustine is saying. Yes, original sin, we're caught in the devil's bargain, but everybody wants to get back to the garden. This is true. So Augustine works this out a little bit further than Joni Mitchell did, though, and says this. He says, I think I know what this is, though, because he's experienced it. He tells us this at the end of Book 10. He said, I've had moments of just being deeply emotionally moved and kind of almost a feeling of ecstasy. We saw this, we'll come back to it. And there's a word for this, and the word is joy. And Augustine says, this is what we're after. This is what the happy life is. We're after joy, and joy is the experience of the truth, and the truth, which is God. And so this is how Augustine works this out. Do you want the happy life? The thing that you really want is joy, because that's the thing we've lost. And the only way to recover this is to find this in the truth of who God is. Okay, so that wraps up the section on memory and gives us an opportunity to jump into what Augustine says about that line in 1 John. But I want to say this first. There's a transition in Book 10. And sometimes the transitions, you kind of read through them, it's like, oh, okay, right. It's like a little bridge I walked over and I'm to the next thing. Okay, but not this time, because when we go to the transition between memory and the happy life and the passage in 1 John about lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, Augustine drops two of probably the four most quotable quotes within all of the confessions. Of course, the first most quotable quote is, Our hearts are restless till they rest in you. You know, every year someone's going to throw that into a sermon. We know that. The other quote, which is constantly misquoted, is, I've never heard it quoted correctly except by myself, is Augustine says, "Give me chastity, but not yet." And everybody gets a good chuckle out of it. Like, it's a zinger. It works really well from the pulpit. That's not what he says, though. He says, "Wretched boy that I was when I used to say, grant me chastity, but not yet." That's what he actually says. So he's not condoning this in any way, shape, or form. Okay, but this is probably the third most quotable quote from the Confessions, and it's in this little section that bridges the two major parts of Book 10. Augustine says, "Late have I loved you, O beauty ever ancient and ever new. Late have I loved you. Behold, you were within me, and I outside of myself, and there I searched for you." And there's one more. I'd say this is probably what the fourth most quotable quote from Confessions. You got to think on this one for a little bit. "Lord, command what you will, and grant what you command." And what Augustine is saying here, in a certain sense, is basically to God, "Look, I'll do whatever you want me to do. I'll do whatever you want me to do in terms of obedience, but you're going to have to supply the strength and the will to be obedient." And so he really identifies this synergistic relationship of grace of, yes, there are things that it's essential that I do, but the grace of God has to come to me to enable me to do it. And this is for Augustine, of course, a great mystery. Okay, so we'll move on to the end here. I more heavily weighted this on the memory side of the book, but we'll catch what's going on here in just the next few minutes and actually end on time, or maybe with a couple minutes for questions. So when we get into part 2 of the book, Augustine's worked through memory, but what he wants to do now is really answer that question, because at the beginning of book 10, he said, "I don't want to write about who I was, I want to write about who I am." Obviously, somebody was asking this. So in part 2 of book 10, Augustine reveals the progress he has made in his own sanctification. And sanctification is, of course, a New Testament word, a Pauline word, but sanctification literally means the process of becoming a saint. And so Augustine's going to talk about, here's where I'm at in the process of sanctification as a 40-year-old-ish bishop in the church in the 4th century. So this is a really remarkable insight into someone who ultimately, of course, was a saint. A little vignette of their life. What did it look like for you, Augustine, as someone who'd been a bishop, who'd been in the service of the church for almost 10 years now? Like, where are you at in your faith? And this is what he says. He offers us something, okay? But I think what he offers us is actually more of a pattern than in the particulars. And we'll see this in just a second. So let's look for the pattern, not necessarily the particulars. What comes out clearly from the second half of book 10 is that there's a critical stage for Augustine in the process of his own sanctification that he describes at length, and we don't have the time to enumerate all the things that he says about this. But the key takeaway is this. Augustine basically says, I came to a point in my life where I deliberately placed myself in a position where I was objectively insulated from grave sin. I know that was a mouthful, and I feel like I need to say it again, because this is what Augustine's saying. I came to a point in my life where I deliberately placed myself in a position that I was objectively insulated from grave sin. This is what he says he did. And we know this from the sort of life that he was living. And so one might think, oh, well, okay, I guess it's just a hop, skip, and a jump to sainthood from there. But Augustus says, but it's not. Because that's like one phase of the journey. That's one phase of the game. You get yourself to a point where you've made the decisions, you've objectively placed yourself in a place where you're largely insulated, if not entirely insulated from grave sin. But then you open up a whole nother stage. And this is what Augustine goes into a great amount of detail on. You open up another stage where, as a believer, you've got to come to terms with the subjective presence of temptation and sin that is practically unavoidable. I think this is illustrated by something Thomas Merton said once, who said a lot of really, really interesting things. But talking about the monastic life, he said, I think there's a misunderstanding. People think that the monks go into the desert to escape the world. And he said, but that's not really what's happening in monasticism. I mean, maybe in some cases, but Merton didn't think so. He said, when the monk goes into the desert, he's taking the world with him there so that he can fight with it alone. That's what's really going on. And I think that works with what Augustine is saying here, because he's a bishop, he lives with brothers in a monastery of his own making. I mean, he's completely insulated from almost any contact with women, even his own sister to some degree. So this is a guy who objectively is not going to get entangled in grave sin. But he says something else happens though. Sin doesn't just go away. Now you've got to deal with these subjective challenges. We don't have time to enumerate all of them. We have enough time to get the main idea that I think Augustine wants to get. So this passage from First John, there's the threefold weakness of the flesh that is uniquely experienced through the five senses, and Augustine's going to organize his discussion around the five senses. He's been doing this the whole book. This actually helps to connect us with everything that we've already seen about memory, because this is where the battle happens in Augustine's mind. The battle happens in memory. So he writes a book. He references continence a few times here. God, you command continence, give what you command. But he actually wrote a book called De Continentia, which is on continence or on self-control. And you will probably not be surprised to learn that most of the book is Augustine talking about how the believer has to win the battle in the citadel of their own mind. Like the whole battle for self-control is not external to us. The whole battle of self-control is in your mind. Well, after book 10, this should not be much of a surprise. So we've got this threefold temptation. But Augustine is probably the first writer in the Western tradition to make this connection between memory and the role of dreams. And this poses a problem for him that we're going to touch on right before we get to the end here. So Augustine walks through the three phases of the temptations of the flesh, and he talks about the problem of dreams. And so he makes the connection that I don't think others have necessarily made, that our dreams are a reflection of our memory. And so what Augustine says is, okay, so here I am, I'm objectively insulated, but I had patterns of behavior in the earlier stage of my life that are still in my memory, that still attack me in my dreams, because when I'm unconscious, I don't have a choice. I can't choose what shows up in my dream. But he recognizes that in conscious life, he's insulated from this type of sin, while subjectively, while asleep, these things still haunt him. So this actually he associates with the sense of touch, not the sense of sight, which is interesting. For Augustine, all throughout his writings, whenever he talks about sensuality or sexual sin, it's not sight. That's not how people thought about it then. This is very much associated with the sense of touch. So he talks about this, and then he works through the senses, and he goes to the sense of taste. So he's kind of taking these in order. And for Augustine, he says, well, here's the problem. The problem with taste is that when we think about natural bodily desires or biological desires, like I can't not eat, right? I can not have sex and live till I'm 90 years old. People do this all the time in monasteries. This is not necessary for biological life, but he says it doesn't work that way with food. You have to eat. And every time I'm confronted with the problem of food, I have to decide whether I'm going to be gluttonous with it or not. Now, his idea of gluttony, I think we would probably find hard to imagine because he really just didn't want to enjoy it too much. But this is where Augustine's head is. Okay, I can be in this position where objectively I'm not eating a lot because I'm a monk, but still, there's still this kind of craven desire for food that I haven't totally mastered. And Augustine's point is it's never going to go away because I can never stop eating. Okay, you see where his head is, right? So this is how he's describing it. So then he deals with taste and the problem of food. Then he goes on to smell and says, well, smell is not really much of a temptation, and kind of side passes that one. Then he goes on to sound and says something that probably we would have a hard time relating to, which is that the love of church music, actually, he felt like it got in the way of his worship. The music was too good. I mean, I don't know which parish you go to every Sunday, but I think most of the parishes around the country, people aren't walking out of church and necessarily saying, man, the music is so good here. It's like it distracts me from the meaning of the words. It distracts me from what's going on here. We all wish we had this problem, but Augustine evidently had this problem. Now, this may seem overly scrupulous to us, but remember, it's not in the particulars, it's in the pattern. And the point that Augustine is making is no matter how insular my life is from grave sin, my five senses are always active. There's always something, there's always some disordered affection that could sneak in to even make me love church music so much that I'm missing the point of what's going on while I'm sitting there. Okay, so that's the first one, the lust of the flesh. We'll knock these next two out in a minute or two, and then maybe just go a minute or two over if you'll indulge me, and we'll be at the end of book 10 and get the punchline. So then Augustine moves on to the second one, the lust of the eyes, which we all think we know what that means, but Augustine says we don't, because through an argument we don't have time to reproduce. He said this is actually the greed for knowledge. We'll just trust him on this for now. But this whole notion of curiosity, we think curiosity is delightful in children. We all feed our curiosity, but Augustine's view of the matter was quite different. Pretty much every time Augustine talks about curiosity, he's got a negative view of this. He sees this as something that can be easily warped in the wrong direction, and is not necessarily an inherently good quality. We don't have time to completely explore that, but just, I guess, note for the future, Augustine's view of curiosity is somewhat dim. But again, the point is, Augustine will say, look, I'm objectively insulated from, this is what he literally says, I'm objectively insulated from astrology and the occult and these sorts of things, which, of course, we hope for in the bishop. But he says, but wait, on this whole issue of curiosity, there is the temptation to desire a sign from God, right? So this is Augustine's point. I can completely cut myself off from astrology and from the occult, but that same principle in my soul, that desire for knowledge that I don't necessarily need to have, might lead me to ask God for a sign. And so it's very interesting the way that Augustine is working all of this out. So he ends on pride, which is where we will end, and then we will come to the conclusion of book 10, which is quite important. Augustine can say with complete integrity, he abandoned the world. He left behind Milan, which was where the imperial court was. Augustine reported to the emperor. There's no up from there. He had influential friends. He had wealthy patrons. He was climbing the social ladder, and he walked away from all of that. So again, objectively, a life characterized by pride, Augustine has abandoned this. But Augustine will say, but subjectively, in the office of a bishop, I'm still exposed to the risk of pride. I'm still exposed to the one thing that almost no one can put out of their souls. And he says it this way: how can we live so as to be indifferent to praise? And for Augustine, it's kind of complicated, because he says, after all, that's what a good life deserves. And if you're living a good life, praise will attend this. But praise is the sort of thing that can very quickly take our pride into directions we don't want to go. And so this is Augustine's point. We may not be able to identify with some of his particulars very readily, but the key takeaway from this is that the first stage, major stage in sanctification, is to deliberately place ourselves in a position where we are objectively insulated from grave sin. And then the real hard work begins, because we have to deal with the subjective reality that our senses never turn off. Our appetites never completely turn off. And most importantly for Augustine, there's not a person living who does not enjoy praise. And this will always present in Augustine's mind the risk of that lapsing into some sort of pride or self-satisfaction. This brings us to the end of the book and tonight. And I want to end just on this note from actually the very end of book 10. So after Augustine has said all of this, the conclusion that he comes to at 1042-67 is rather remarkable. He's looked to the external world. He's taken an examination of himself. He's taken a fuller inventory of memory than anybody in the ancient world even got close to doing. And he basically says, when I come to the end of this, I need to find a mediator. This is the problem that he resolves in his mind, that he resigns to in his mind, because I've not found God. I've found God within myself by nature, but I've not found God within myself by grace. And so Augustine points out something, and he says, I've explored the human experience as far as it can be explored, and the answer that I need is I need a mediator. I need a mediator between God and man, because there's no other solution. And part of this is informed by Neoplatonism that was also looking for mediators, but in the wrong way. And so the end of book 10 is Augustine repeating in a threefold way that Christ is the mediator. Christ is the mediator between God and man, and this is what I need to find the happy life. And this is the source of joy. And it culminates in this. At 1043:69, in reference to Christ as mediator, he says something that is probably in Paul and certainly in the book of Hebrews, which maybe Paul wrote. For us before you, he is priest and sacrifice, and priest because he is the sacrifice. And then at the very end of book 10, this is where Augustine actually ends book 10, these lines. He says, I think upon the price of my redemption, and I eat and I drink it, and I distribute it. Okay, well, there's no question what he's talking about here. What he eats and he drinks and he distributes, that's the price of his redemption. In my poverty, I desire to be satisfied from it together with those who eat and are satisfied, and they shall praise the Lord who seek him. The important point at the end of book 10 here is that they shall praise the Lord who seek him is an echo of the opening of book 1 again. And in the context of that part of the Confessions, Augustine makes the point. He says, basically, I need a preacher. This is where the opening of book 1 is. He said, how will they believe unless they hear? How will they hear unless someone is sent? There's got to be preaching. Well, now he's linking something at the very end of book 10, which has been a theme that we saw at the beginning of book 10, which is this whole idea that preaching, Christ is present to us in preaching. This is where we find the mediator. And Christ is present to us in the Eucharist, which is where we actually experience the mediator. And so Augustine ends book 10 in a rather remarkable way, having looked to the external world, having taken full inventory of his senses, having explored memory, having confessed very candidly where he is at in the process of his own sanctification. He lands here. I don't think I need add anything by way of comment to the picture, but this is where book 10 ends. And it is a rather remarkable ending to a rather remarkable book. So we can stop there for tonight. And I think there might be one question. Is there a way to get your notes for later study? Yeah, I can send the notes out to anyone that would be interested in them, or I can post them to the message board. I would be happy to do so.
Hey, Kevin, I appreciate it. At risk of stoking your pride, this is awesome. Each one of these sessions just continues to get better, and couldn't be more grateful to you for all the effort you put into this. And I was taking notes throughout. It was really great. So thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you to everybody who joined as well. And I wish you all a very peaceful and blessed evening, and God bless you all. Good night. Thank you, Kevin.